I will speak English tonight, and first of all, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. It's a great pleasure to read this kind of lecture in Sykhiv, in Leuven, but also in particular in this urban setting. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I am particularly glad to speak about green zones or green spaces, because usually socialist architecture or architecture of socialist cities, Soviet cities, is blamed to be grey, monotonous, dull, whereas I would argue and devote at least 14 minutes of me talking here to the fact that in comparison to more traditional urban designs, developments of late 19th century, and in comparison to later developments, especially for instance, recent developments in post-Soviet space, actually the neighborhoods developed in the 1950s, 1960s in the Soviet Union are surprisingly green. Well, especially if you get to see them in between April and October. It's true that some of those spaces might be a bit sadder on winter months, but this is, I think, beyond the control of architects or urban planners. And these places are not only quite green, but they also provide ample public spaces for leisure activities of different kinds. And so I would like to propose to you to see development of green zones actually as one of the central ideas of Soviet architecture and urban planning. So what I will try to show to you today is that in many ways creating different kind of green zones ranging from children playgrounds, alleys, and central parks of leisure and activities, as well as designing landscape architecture in the residential areas, were actually part and parcel of the task of developing or finding ideal living environment. So throughout the history of Soviet history of and the history of architectural profession, designing ideal living environment and figuring out what is the place of the greenery in the ideal environment. Actually, these two stories cannot be split apart and cannot be separated. So I will focus in the major part of my talk on the history of Soviet modernism, on the period of 1950s, 1960s, and in particular on the microrayon designs and some experimental designs of the 60s that help us understand better what was the thinking of the architects on these topics. However, in order to introduce these developments of the 50s, 60s, I would like to walk you through some of the earlier projects. And I realized that, and while thinking about this presentation, I realized actually there is important continuity between different efforts to make these cities green. And one could even say that from the very beginning, the very idea of the socialist city is tightly linked to the task of rendering it green, making it a green city. Well, as you know, after the Russian Revolution, the task of improving living conditions of the toiling masses was really the major priority for the architectural professions and for the authorities that promised to provide and improve the conditions in the cities for those who were rather underprivileged, right, before. And the history of socialist planning is, of course, part and parcel of a broader search of the architectural profession, not only in the Soviet context, but pan-European context, an attempt to develop an alternative model to European industrial city that was harshly criticized since the late 19th century in the professional circles across West and East. The industrial city was associated with the smoke, dirt, poor hygienic standards, and finding an alternative model to resolving this kind of condition was the major task of the architectural profession across Europe. And Soviet architects were not so different from their colleagues in the West. They also saw overcoming the limits of the industrial city as the key task. And green is a very important part of that discourse. It's really a decor in some way. It's one of the metaphors that dominates this discourse or this critique of industrial cities. So the green city emerges as ultimate alternative to the dirty, smoky industrial city of the late 19th century, described by described for instance by Engels in his famous critique of industrial cities in the late 19th century. So from the very beginning, even the titles of the project bared green in there. Well, the titles had green, the word green. For instance, I would like to speak about one of the early avant-garde designs by very famous constructivist architect Ivan Leonidov, who was part of the Society of Contemporary or Modern Architects, one of the leading movements in the 1920s in the Soviet Union. Together with colleagues, it's a collective project. It's always important to remind us that it's actually a collective project, but the team was headed by Ivan Leonidov. They designed a scheme for socialist city of Magnitogorsk, which was supposed to be created from the scratch in the Ural Mountains, in line with the program of rapid industrialization of the late 1920s. In many regards, this project crystallized some of the ideas and reflections of the architects of the 1920s. And let me maybe speak a bit about the project per se. It was actually a design for a linear city that was structured, well, but basically it's a stretch of 15 miles around the communication route, which led from industrial hubs, so from the industrial side of Magnitogorsk, to the state farms, agricultural area, and was structured as a grid. This is a typical modernist solution, of course, thinking in terms of grid or these functional metaphors are the dominating language and the thinking of the architects at the time. Landscape and urbanization seem to be somewhat reconciled. All the built functions are distributed in natural settings. So basically this is the towers in the park. Similar ideas become the norm or become the key elements of such modernist designs as the radiant city of Le Corbusier, and would dominate the language of modernist architecture throughout the 30s, 40s and 50s. This is exactly the representation of that, or the embodiment of that idea that we can already see in this design. The towers allowed to liberate the land in order to have more gardens, more space for leisure activities for the citizens of this new socialist city. So in some way, I wanted to begin with this project because it's really the emblem of this ideology of providing green and light as an antidote, or as an ultimate panacea against the designs of old industrial cities. However, I would argue that this is still a very abstract notion of nature that the modernists work with. There is definitely this obsession with the green already as a tool to enforce this more hygienic environment, right? It's already there, yet it's a very abstract nature, if you wish, that we find in these kind of designs. I would even say that in some way, I think thinking about landscape was really not the strongest part of the constructivist movement. In many regards, I mean, they are to be praised for many innovations and inventions, and landscape clearly is also rethought quite radically. However, there is not so much thinking put into, or if you want, there is not so much details yet in thinking through the landscape. However, what is interesting is that, and we rarely know that part of the story, that actually the constructivists would get to master landscape much more in the years to come. As you know, in 1932, the course of Soviet architecture changed quite radically from, well, the architects were demanded to switch to more monumental architecture. But actually, some of the constructivists who also had to adjust to the new political course turned to working on gardening, on designs for gardens and leisure spaces. So instead of switching to designing new monumental residential buildings or administrative buildings, they turned to designing gardens. And I would like to refer here to the work of Fabien Bella, a French scholar, who traces the history of how former constructivists reworked the French tradition of Sun King tradition of gardening for purposes of Soviet gardens. And before I show you some designs, maybe also another important thing to mention, that this obsession with greenery was not only typical of architectural profession. In some way, actually, throughout the 1920s, 1930s, we see that this demand for green penetrates into very different spheres. You might know that Lenin established such a practice as subotniki, which was a practice of voluntarily work on Saturdays for improving the community setting. So sometimes planting trees, sometimes simply cleaning up immediate environments, or decorating the houses. And I wanted to show you the poster from the 1930s that calls for greening the industry. So even the plants were supposed to become green. In some way, I mean, you see it's a nice collage, clearly still working with the aesthetics of the 20s avant-garde, that introduces green both as color and as a concept in the space that is usually devoid of it, that is usually not associated with the green. So in some way it's no surprise that then the pioneers of avant-garde, who saw their task as transforming the living conditions or radically changing the lifestyle of people through architecture, turned to gardens. This is not only the story of different strategies of surviving of former avant-gardists in the 1930s, but it also says something about the status of this work in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. Greening or making the cities green is no small task in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, 1940s. And kind of to make the story coherent, I chose the designs of the same guy, Ivan Leonidov, the pioneer of avant-garde movement, who throughout the 1930s, so here you see 3 projects, the last one is implemented, developed designs for the Hermitage Gardens in Moscow. There you see that the general design is still much inspired by the aesthetics of constructivism. So you see geometric forms. It's a design for a garden, but that works with similar kind of lines and aesthetics as his previous designs for the cities. The second project is a project for Artek in Crimea in 1934. There, I wanted also to show you the, ask you to pay attention, maybe you would see the flower beds are designed also to represent the world map. You see Latin America, you see Northern America, and then there is this Eurasia. And not only Ivan Leonidov worked on designing schemes for different leisure spaces, but he also got to implement some of his designs. One of the most famous design, well, landscape, one could say landscape design of Ivan Leonidov is the project of the staircase in the sanatorium of Narkomtashprom. Well, that works with the interesting landscape of the Kislovodsk and reworks it through architectural means, rendering this space, well, one would argue socialist. Leonidov was not the only architect from the generation of the pioneers of avant-garde who worked on the green cities and then switched to designing parks. Of course, another famous case is the design of Konstantin Melnikov, and I wanted to talk in particular about the design for the Central Park of Culture and Leisure in Moscow that was named after Gorky and is also known as Gorky Park. It was, from the very beginning, an important site for experimentation. As of 1920s, it was really the site of experimentation. And there were many designs submitted once the decision was taken also to transform it into a central park of leisure and culture. And apart from Melnikov, Moisei Ginsburg, another leader of modern architecture movement in the Soviet Union, submitted his designs for this site. And I think what I wanted, I think it's important to contextualize a bit. Actually, designing these kind of parks would become a must for every Soviet city. Nowadays, we can find this kind of typical as a concept, so central park of culture and leisure has proliferated as a typology literally across all Soviet cities, be that provincial cities, be that capital cities. Looking at the example of Gorky Park, I wanted to look at just pay maybe a couple of minutes more of our attention to that story. What is interesting in particular is, of course, that actually these kind of spaces were not accessible to urbanites before. In that sense, it's innovation. As a format, it's an innovation. Before the Russian Revolution, there were myriads of fascinating parks designed for private mansions, but they were not accessible for public. Once the property regime changed, those places were open to the publics, but again, these were parks for tsars or parks for aristocrats, and the Soviet architects were interested to rethink the format also of the park, or the park design. And the experimentation around Gorky Park is exactly the search of this typology. What is the ideal public park for the socialist city? As you might know from your experience of going to these kind of parks in other places of the former Soviet Union, eventually these kind of parks provided ample greenery, but also a lot of places for different culture and leisure activities, both sport activities and culture activities. Those parks often had green theaters, sites for collective dancing or for cinema screenings, often some spaces that could accommodate different activities of groups of interests, so chess club or aviation construction club, something of that kind. So the task of designing central parks of culture and leisure was not limited to creating the lungs of the city and providing ample greenery, but also providing rich social and cultural infrastructure for, and in that sense, educating and enlightening the socialist citizen, forging a very particular type of subjectivity. And actually, these parks have a quite interesting afterlife. And I want to just briefly mention the recent modernization projects. Well, we still stay in Moscow with Gorky Park. It was redesigned in 2012, and actually now is again a very popular site. Some of the activities changed, so there are fewer chess clubs now and more yoga going on in the park. There are also more burger places and coffee places than stands with selling kvass and lemonade. But this kind of recycling of that heritage and this kind of spaces also shows that it is something to work. It is an interesting object to work with, and it's and there are good examples of recoding it. However, maybe I should also say that actually, thanks to these efforts of designing parks, and here I would like also to mention one more name of one more avant-garde architect, Korzev, who was actually the student of Ladovsky, another important leader of the modern architecture in the Soviet Union. So here he designed, he was less modernist in designs of his parks. So here up there you see that some of the tricks invented by Leonidov, for instance, were replicated in designs of others. So there is another flower bed designed as a world map, which again means that this designing a park and green space was tightly linked to the task of education or enlightenment, right? So this somehow went hand in hand, these two tasks. And clearly the other picture that I show is this is the design of the Moscow State University Park, which you see in terms of shapes is maybe more neoclassical and recycling some of the French garden traditions. However, all that work on creating parks basically was part of establishing a subfield of urban studies and urban development discipline of greening the city. So Korzev, for instance, by 1950s has de facto become one of the leaders in the subfield of well, making cities green or greening the cities. And I show here his volume published by the Academy of Architecture of the Soviet Union that is titled Greening the Soviet Cities. This is basically an instruction to the professionals with some norms and guidelines. It was published in 1954 and summed up all the research and work done. You really should understand that greening the cities have become a huge industry, not only in terms of proliferation of this type across the cities, right? It's not only that they had to build a lot of parks, but that this task required emerging of new professions, and things like plant nurseries. So in the Soviet Union throughout the 1930s, 1940s, in parallel to this development, there would be plenty of new plant nurseries created. So the profession of botanist would actually also pick up importance because you need to, in order to plan the city, in order to plan those alleys, in order to create those parks, you actually had simply to have trees that are not too small to be planted, right? So they had to, there was really all the work put in order to create the entire cycle of greening the city. And actually this is something, again, very interesting in terms of, when we look into the afterlife or what happened to that segment of the profession after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, you know that the green spaces were often sacrificed to development of highways. So one example that I can mention from, again, Moscow context is the enlargement of the main boulevard, main highway street, Tverskaya Street. So in the 1990s, they simply cut the trees and enlarged the road. Nobody at that moment really cared if it's going to be green enough or not. Recently, Strelka Institute of Media and Design proposed the renovation project of Moscow that tried to fight the cars back and return it to pedestrians. So part of the project was about enlarging the pedestrian area and about replanting Tverskaya Street. But this time, the trees had to be brought from Germany, from nursery plants, from plant nurseries in Germany. So this is the project, but now it's planted, but there was all this complex operation of bringing grown-up linden trees from Germany to Moscow, which is in some way, in many ways, is insane, especially in the context when we continue cutting down forests on the margins of Moscow while building other highways, like famous controversy around Khimkinsky forest. Well, I'll leave it as a paradox. But again, so this development has an interesting afterlife and also maybe something to reflect about. So this is, I think, some of the developments that I wanted to mention before I switch to the key visions for greening the city and developing green zones by the modernist architects in the 1950s, 1960s. When we think about the 1950s, of course, first of all, we think about the mass construction campaign launched by Khrushchev on December 7, 1954, that resulted in the construction of microrayons, so micro-districts, literally all across the Soviet Union, and we know that this model even traveled beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, and we find similar kind of neighborhoods in Eastern Europe, Vietnam, China, Cuba, and so on and so forth. In order to understand what place greenery played in this vision, one has to understand that the architects working on the designs of microrayons were responding to the current urban planning practice and to current need to re-envision what is residential architecture. Microrayon theory is very much a response to some of the failures of the Stalin-era architecture in urban planning, and most importantly, in a focus on monumentality. Given that the regime was quite obsessed at the time with monumental construction, and at the same time failed to provide its citizens with decent housing, the architects saw these two problems as intertwined. The architects, the group of architects who would eventually we associate with the invention of the microrayon scheme, such people as Nathan Osterman, Evgeny Yochelis, Mikhail Galaktionov. In the 1940s, so after World War II, they worked in two directions. They researched different prefabrication technologies because it was clear that in order to provide enough housing to people, and the housing crisis got only worsened by the World War II in the Soviet Union, especially on the in the Western borderlands. And prefabrication was seen as a solution to providing building quick and cheap and efficiently. Second part of the search was rethinking what actually residential architecture stands for. So if these are not monumental buildings lined along the avenues that are supposed to grasp or represent the power of the Soviet Union, what could redefine residential neighborhood? And this group of architects turned their attention to the schemes developed in Anglo-American contexts as of 1920s, 1930s, in particular to the theory of neighborhood units developed by Clarence Perry and Patrick Abercrombie in the British context. And in turning to this, and they tried to basically rework that model for Soviet context and for the needs of Soviet citizens. So we are dealing here with a very interesting story of transfer of ideas or adjustment, adaptation, translation of the neighborhood unit principle to Soviet context. Macrorayon was meant to be a district that provides different social and cultural facilities, and the architects argued that the typology of housing has to be completely different. This has to be modest kind of housing, laconic architecture. In fact, I would say that this rethinking housing in the post-war Soviet context goes quite in parallel to overall shift in post-war Europe towards praising or really cherishing domesticity, cherishing the value of home life. I think the trauma of World War II actually made the architects aware of the importance of home life, and finding the adequate form for simple things, right? People, after all, really need a home, but maybe they don't need much more than that. And this more, if you wish, human or humanistic understanding of housing also did not require the housing to be spectacular anymore. So it's not only turned to prefabrication that dictated this shape, or the shape of those microrayons. There was also some understanding that housing can be more laconic, housing can be more, well, of simpler shapes and forms. However, it was exactly in this context that in this reflection about what makes residential architecture, what makes residential neighborhood cozy, comfortable, that the architects turned to greenery. Nathan Osterman, in his design for a first experimental neighborhood, and I show here pictures from this neighborhood in Moscow, the 9th neighborhood of Novye Cheremushki that was constructed in the southwestern part of Moscow at the site of a former village, Novye Cheremushki. In description of this design, he stressed that the importance of greenery and of small architectural forms and of flowers on the balconies and of the summer houses. And given that it was a first experimental project, the builders actually had a chance to implement most of those ideas. So as a result, the first microrayon constructed in the Soviet Union actually had quite this lyric quality. So there was a pond for children, there were plants that only with time grew taller and got created even more idyllic green yards. The citizens, well, the new urbanites were encouraged to plant flowers on the balconies. There was all these little details and infrastructure, if you wish, provided, right? So there were boxes for flowers. There was all that work put into the detailing. We know that, however, many other identical neighborhoods constructed in the 1950s, 1960s often lacked this kind of detailing, and the development of the green zones in those areas often lagged behind. The constructing industry and the authorities insisted on really high pace of construction because the main task was actually to provide as many people as possible with new flats. And this kind of decoration of neighborhood somehow got a bit, well, stopped being prioritized. Whereas for me it was important to remind all of us about the initial aspirations or initial design for microrayons. However, it's not a story of complete failure. So although indeed some of those microrayons were not always very well, were not so well designed as Novye Cheremushki, progressively throughout the 1950s, 1960s, the architects succeeded in creating quite unique landscapes across the Soviet Union. So again, often the architects had to work with very limited tools in creating microrayons. They were often limited in the typologies that they could use for the housing and for the buildings within the microrayon, be that schools or kindergartens. All that was standardized, and the architects had very little control over that. But what they could have control over was actually landscaping. And so those architects who were a bit more ambitious, or who took the task of designing microrayons really seriously, actually created quite fascinating landscapes. Here I have some projects that received attention throughout the 1970s, 1980s, were praised by the profession, well, within the Soviet Union, but also that actually have quite good afterlives after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So here in the lower corner you see the Belyaevo district in Moscow that has a quite fascinating system of greenery. There was a system of ponds that was preserved, so the architects actually worked with the given landscape and tried to preserve as much as possible the natural elements of the construction site. The upper corner is the famous project in Riga, Latvian Socialist Republic, and Baltic states could be praised in particular, and were praised in particular for delicate work with the natural setting. So well, these are pine trees that are preserved, often working with the landscape, preserving some of the changes of the levels and so on. Kiev neighborhood Rusyanov was also distinguished by Soviet architectural profession as a successful work with the with water, making it Venice of Kiev, right? It's an interesting example of how water could be introduced into the kind of standardized micro districts. And the last picture I show you is from Baku. And Soviet architects took particular pride in greening the cities in the southern republics of the Soviet Union. So cities like Tashkent, cities like Yerevan, Baku, that were in the climate zones that actually rendered the task of greening those cities sometimes, well, in contemporary terms, not always sustainable and ecological. But in the spirit of providing identical living conditions to the workers all across the Soviet Union, there was no questioning of changing the ideal of green city in different climate zones. And so it's very interesting also to see how these parks are either sustained or not after the 91, because indeed it actually, I mean, it raises a lot of interesting questions of what we cherish more, this kind of fiction of green city that is the metaphor for healthy living conditions, and or we actually cherish our water resources more and do not allocate unproportional amount of water resources into maintaining these green spaces, right? So it's, I speak about that less, but of course part of the creation of green zones of different kind, be that parks or as parts of the residential neighborhoods, was also creation of fontains. And again, that's particularly striking in the context like Tashkent, like Baku. Can we really afford all those fontaines? Ask municipal authorities today. So this is the, well, this is a very important story about the kind of socialist modernism that got built. So although this scheme had its limitations, we rightly criticize those neighborhoods for technology of prefabrication that was not always well, either implemented well, or the kind of typologies that were used maybe are not exactly compatible with the standards that we apply to this housing today. However, this is a large material heritage that we are still dealing with, and many people actually these days appreciate those places exactly for the green spaces, ample green spaces. An ongoing reconstruction in Moscow these days, the large program of demolishing yet another thousands of former Khrushchevki, so intervening in microrayons and demolishing the standardized buildings of the first generation. Part of the debate actually centers on those people who defend these neighborhoods and their housing and do not want to move out and or be displaced. Actually use as an argument or suggests what is the great advantage of these neighborhoods is the green spaces, and see these programs of reconstruction as an attack on green spaces or privatization of green spaces by richer or people who can now move into these new developments. So it's really like question also of access to the green. Who can have an access to the green in modern Moscow? But apart from that story that is indeed constitutes the major built heritage of socialist modernism, I wanted to talk about one experimental project. As any experimental project, it actually allows really to venture into and better understand how socialist architects, being not limited, be that by prefabrication technology, be that by norms of the building industry, how they imagined ideal setting or ideal urban environment. And I would like to talk in particular about the project of NER, which I would argue is a form of critique of mainstream modernism or socialist modernism. In 1966, the major Soviet publishing house, Stroizdat, released a new title, which was a new book titled New Element of Settlement, Новый элемент расселения, towards a new city, which was co-authored by a group of young authors. Here you can see their names. These were actually a group of relatively young and unknown Moscow architects who, and the book was based on the diploma project that they made at the Moscow Architectural Institute in 1960. That's one of the designs of the diploma project that you see here. Both the diploma project at Moscow Architectural Institute and the book that resulted from that project, I would argue, is the most radical manifesto of post-Stalin architecture. And because it at once attempted to revise the approach to mass housing of the time, so it was a critique of what was going on after Khrushchev intervened, and so it was a critique of the mainstream approach to construction of urban environment in the Soviet Union. But it was also an attempt to offer, really imagine a global and utopian, in some way utopian scheme of human settlement in the future. So this task was no little one. They basically tried to offer a scheme for settlement of the entire planet in the future. In the opening pages, the author stated, "Today the city does not fulfill its essential purpose, which is to be an organic living environment." And they saw their mission, in other words, in finding such a diagram that will correspond to this ideal organic urban environment. Among the most intriguing aspects for me about this futuristic project are actually the fact that the NER group shifted basically from viewing the city as tabula rasa to conceiving of it as urban living environment. And in some way, they actually are the first architects in the Soviet Union to acknowledge the city's material reality and the necessity to operate in this complex both cultural and natural context. So rather than transform radically the given, right, like the project of Leonidov proposed, or like the microrayon scheme very much neglected whatever village was built there, right? You just well, it's an urban renewal logic, right? They actually were among the first. Okay, 10 minutes is good because it's one project that I want to talk about. So for me, the most interesting things about that that project is this interest in organic or making environment organic, and actually the very interest in environment. So here may be a short linguistic note. Environment in Russian is stands for the in Russian it is sreda. So it stands not only for natural context, but also for the immediate surroundings. So when I'm going to talk about their reading of what is natural environment, I mean, I'm not only interested in how they understand nature, but also how they work with the immediate environment. So let me walk you through two things: how they conceived of housing and how they conceived of organic environment, right, or relation to, or what they thought would make environment organic. So in terms of their vision for housing, they were not so different from the mainstream modernists. Basically, they proposed towers in the park. And when you read their description of the housing, this is very much resonates with the rhetoric of modernist movement, of Corbusier language. Light and landscape penetrate into areas where until recently darkness and bleakness ruled. It could have been written in the beginning of the 20th century. Buildings spark to let us pass. Sun and gardens surround them all on all sides. They stand free of the soil, leaving the land to the man. So very much this obsession with providing greenery, light, improving the hygienic standards for the workers. What is interesting is that they proposed to build these new settlements in free nature. So this is where we need to pause for a second. So what do they understand by free nature? So in some way, this, their global reading of the planet, how they divided the planet. So planet was clearly divided into industrial zones, so place for industry. Then there was agricultural areas, well, used to for, and then there was free nature. That could be used for creating these idyllic settlements. And somehow there was no awareness that there might be zones protected for wild, well, left for animals. So basically we are dealing with the total humanization of the planet, right? So humanization of nature. In other words, nature is subordinated to the needs of humans. Nature is instrumentalized. Nature is has these unlimited resources that could be used for providing ideal conditions or ideal living environment. In that sense, this is high modernism. This is instrumentalization of nature. This is no different from most of the modernist designs and in general professional thinking of the time. So their task was just to ensure that there is enough, that the settlements are placed in good green zones. However, there is maybe one more thing to say. So it's about this tension with wilderness, right? So again, approaching the housing to nature, but this should not be confused with them idealizing nature or wilderness. There is one fascinating description of, I mean, their thinking about agriculture actually allows to understand how they conceive of nature. Agriculture was also supposed to be transformed through technology, so we are in the mid-20th century. This is the time when we still believe that technology and progress would make us produce in any environments possible, disregarding what are the soils, disregarding what are the climatic conditions. So in that sense, it's really this 60s futurist and obsession with technology. So this is a vision that basically proposed to urbanize the entire planet. However, the second part of the story that I wanted to tell about NER, and then I will wrap up, is about their weird understanding of what organic actually, what is this, why did they knew that somehow they saw their task that in designing organic living environments. And that has to do with criticism of mainstream modern. It has to do with criticism of particular aesthetics. So they saw their task in making urban environment more human-oriented, more human scale, less rational, less dominated by strict direct lines, so respecting human curvature. So curves, right? Introducing curves, organic forms, thinking not in rigid grids, and then respecting more the context. So again, there is no yet much respect for nature. However, there is a growing awareness that context, the given environment, is something to work with. This is one more step to a type of thinking like we find similar kind of reflection in Europe among such architects as Alto Rossi. So it's one more step to preserving historic cities. In fact, I would argue what is interesting about this design and their thinking is that progressively the NER architects would shift to working with historical fabric, so this whole idea of making more human scale, human-oriented designs would lead them also to working with urban fabric of historic cities. Usually this story is told like, these people got disappointed in all these modernist designs of the 60s, there was no way out, and they turned to preservation. However, to me it seems that there is an important link between their thinking about organic urban environment in the 60s and their projects on intervention into historic Moscow, for instance, in the 70s. Their discourse would also be penetrated with a lot of biological metaphors, so they would use words like plasma, riverbed, they would talk about fabric a lot, all these connections will be described through the ecological terms almost, to biological terms. But again, it's not only the language that changes, but it's indeed kind of a different image, vision that emerges. So, to cut the story short, long story short, I would say that the story of this group, so this is the projects for the reconstruction of Moscow that I can answer then the questions. The story of the NER group usually is, well, could be understood as a story of the first Soviet architects, environmentalists, but again, environment understood not necessarily as ecological system, but rather as people working with urban environment, with second nature, if you wish. So, not only the word environment entered into their professional speak, but they also sought to reimagine the role of architect to make him more or less a designer of environment, right, or landscape, designer of comprehensive space. The NER group saw their mission in creating organic environment. Then it's another question how we define what makes environment organic. But the idea was really to adjust it to humans, to make it an organic environment for scaled, well, human scale. And in some way, they shifted understanding of the mission of the architect from, radically intervening and radically changing both nature and urban context into, well, creating second nature, or redesigning the nature and adjusting natural environment to human needs. But at the same time, it's still 60s, 70s, it's still a story of contradiction. We are far away from any straightforward ecological thinking. Their story is the story of contradiction. So on one hand, they seek to propose an alternative to this mass-produced, standardized technology environment. But somehow they are, I try to explain when speaking about housing, they remain trapped in this modernist dream of total humanization of nature, of total urbanization, for instance, right? So there is not much sensitivity about the fact that resources might be limited and nature is not to be instrumentalized and subordinated to the needs of humans only. And at the same time, so one thing is kind of humanization of nature, but the contradiction of it is that with the search for more organic forms of urban environment, they embark on the process of naturalization of urban, be that through looking for alternative typologies, alternative urban typologies, lines, different aesthetics, be that their awareness of the need to work with the given urban environment, with the given context, with the given forms and typologies. So in many regards, it's an important break with the modernist tradition, and especially with the ongoing Soviet urban practice, so building all those microrayons. So it's a very hybrid project in that regards. And why I think it is interesting to look into both microrayon and this kind of experimentation or critique of mainstream modernism today is that in some way it's both built heritage and intellectual heritage that allows us to well, maybe we could use it as some form of foundation when we push further our reflection about reconciling first and second nature, when we push further our thinking about well, when we try to imagine green cities that are not only human-oriented, but are also more in harmony with the well, complex ecological system. So when we try maybe to imagine not a new way of settlement, but a new ecological way of settlement, for this purpose maybe it's really interesting to look back into this experimentation. Thanks.
Well, and now it's our time. I want to see your hands. There is one hand raised.
I was going to ask you a question in English, but I will switch into Ukrainian. Okay.
You can do it whatever way you prefer.
Thank you for your lecture. And I have two questions, rather comments, but we could transform them into questions. You mentioned briefly in your lecture about different climatic zones and differences in planning and designing the planned neighborhoods in different climatic conditions, because it would make a difference if you talk about the Central Asia, which is warm, and some colder areas. So were these peculiarities considered in designing these neighborhoods? And another question is about the relation to the nature. This is always the relation of the subject and object. Either you are trying to master this nature and adjust it to the social needs, or you are protecting it. So this is always imposing your agency. If we talk about Latour's terminology, there was no this agency. Did they have any attempts in these experimentations to take another different look on the nature?
Oh, thank you very much. These are fantastic questions. So first about climate. There was a research on different climate zones in the Soviet Union starting as the 1950s, but it was not applied to construction from early on. So we know from the early construction, from the first stages of reconstruction of Tashkent, for instance, that some of the basics were not applied to the construction. So in some instances, for instance, the houses were sited east-west instead of north-south. The research on different climate zones also lagged behind the typologies that were developed for prefabrication. So first of all, they basically had to do all the experimentation work on the technology per se, and only then they developed adjustments for different cities. What is also helpful when we think about the construction in different climate zones is, I think it's also important to remember the history of urbanization of the Soviet Union and realize that the settlement of the northern cities, like mass settlement, with especially with the discovery of oil, begins only in the 70s. So luckily for the north, some of the mistakes were avoided. However, that's not the case for the more southern destinations. So there, and Tashkent is one such place. So the story is ambivalent. There is a growing awareness for need of diversity of types and technologies for different climate zones. However, from the very beginning, there was a desynchronization between the construction and the research. And the second question is especially good when we talk about all this nature and nature culture. Indeed, Marxism is often blamed in general, right, for being this culture of thought or tradition of thought that instrumentalizes nature, that sees nature as an object. So in that sense, it's also part of that intellectual tradition. And in that sense, Soviet architects were not very well equipped to think otherwise. There is very interesting research that shows that actually not all Marxism is reduced to instrumentalization of nature. For instance, and in the Soviet Union we know there is from early on some efforts to create zapovedniki, the zones of protection. There is at least more awareness there that nature is not reduced to the tasks of industrialization. I mean, it's basically not only the source base, but still still this objectification of nature persists, even in this strand of thought. So it won't be until very late, and I'm not so sure that even in today's professional realities there is this that the STS methodology, a way of thinking about or breaking away from this binary nature culture is happening. So I think the Soviet story is the story in that sense of the 20th century objectification of nature and seeing it as a limited resource and an object rather than a subject on its own.
Thank you for this lecture. I would like to touch upon the second topic that you're professionally dealing with, the professionals in architecture. I'm really interested to know, even though you were providing more examples from the capital cities and the most interesting thinkers and leaders in this sphere, but could you explain somehow how in the Soviet Union was this training of experts for greenery of cities was developing and other related professions? Was it centralized or decentralized? And how these schools or maybe training centers were developed gradually to train these new professions? Or did they have to go to Moscow to get these skills? Or maybe there were other alternative places in the Soviet Union that were more advanced in this respect, or how was it all structured?
That's a great question, but I have not done actually enough research to respond to it. So I can, from indeed from my doctoral research in the profession, I can respond about the general dynamics in institutional layout of the profession, and my first hypothesis would be that for the greenery part of the story, it's pretty much the same. So of course you have a hyper-centralization of the profession until late 1950s, early 1960s. So the major research institutes are located in such capital cities as Moscow and St. Petersburg. So they are competing schools, but still it's close to hyper-centralization, right? For instance, the Institute of Greenery that was set up within the structure of the Academy of Architecture, which was de facto the leading body within the research section of the profession. And these kind of institutions were responsible for developing guidelines and standards. So the book that I referred to, it's an example of this kind of instruction and the key principles for developing greenery in the cities. It's actually a very comprehensive volume that covers very different aspects of greenery, from large-scale developments like creating parks to minor questions of what bushes to use for which kind of streets in residential areas. So really and this kind of literature was obligatory for also the students of urban planning departments. It was not until the mid-60s that architectural schools began to pop up in provincial cities across the Soviet Union. So we basically have always people from different parts of the city first going to study in Moscow and St. Petersburg and getting access to all that centralized knowledge. So it's not until so it will take another generation. Once the schools were set up in places like Sverdlovsk, for instance, there was an architectural institute set up there in the 60s. It would take another generation for a school to emerge. So we do not have. It's hard to speak about provincial schools of thought. However, Soviet Union is a very complex state that had this complex federal structure, that also had as its subjects, for instance, Baltic republics that were annexed as a result of World War II. And there you can, of course, speak about national schools or different approaches that the architects inherited from the interwar period. So you have a diversification, but it's not linked to the institutional design of the profession. It has to do rather with the structure of the Soviet Union. So that is as much as I could answer about that.
Hello, I'm from Prague, and you talk a lot about the greenery and its importance. I want to ask you if Soviet planners counted with actual greenery which was in the area before the development, because everybody knows that it takes a lot of time to raise a tree, and I know from my hometown that during the new developments almost all of the greenery is destroyed, and then planners are just planting new trees, so it is confusing.
Yes, it's true. Indeed, so for the architects who conceived the microrayon scheme, in the guidelines for ideal microrayon, greenery was an important element. So creating green spaces was proclaimed to be an important task in developing microrayon. However, in practice, also in some instances, because of the specificity of building technology, the site was evened so that the cranes could assemble the houses. I mean, it's a particular technology that also requires particular construction site, if you wish, that is quite flat. So it was not uncommon that the landscape, inherited landscape, was not respected, was destroyed, what you described, right? It was destroyed, and then they planted these new trees that it took 10 years for them to grow, and actually transformed the neighborhood into this nice, quite green living environment. And so in this sense, it's the story also that changes over the decades. So the first construction sites were often not very respectful towards the landscape. But progressively, the architects realized that they were very limited in their tools for creating microrayons, and progressively tried to insist on preserving or working with the inherited landscape. It was possible in some cases not. So then it really varies from place to place, from the kind of landscape to work with, so it's not an uneven story. And well, second part of that story is this story about plant nurseries. So there was also entire industry to actually help green these newly constructed microrayons quicker with cultures that grow quick. So there was all research done on which bushes develop quick enough, and how then they could create the mass of greenery, and then other trees could be progressively introduced. So it was this multi-step system of greening the microrayons.
У мене до вас таке питання. Як людини 21-го вже сторіччя.
I have a question to you as a person of the 21st century. Was any of the design projects that were implemented, could you give us any examples that things were done well and people live there and they enjoy living there? Because in my life, I can have one example from 1970s. I read in the Soviet newspapers that there was the Lenin Award in architecture from Vladinai neighborhood in Vilnius. We know Vilnius as an old city, historical city. So what kind of project design should it be to have the Lenin Award? So when I went to Vilnius in 1980, I went there to this neighborhood to see it, and I was thrilled because I came from Sykhiv, from Mayorivka, from Topolna Street. So when I got to this neighborhood, I couldn't believe this was the Soviet Union. So those of you who have no idea, this was the satellite neighborhood. So when you get out of Vilnius and then you get a bus or the trolley bus 2 kilometers in the pine forest, and then you suddenly get into the opening, and they never fell these trees, and they just built these houses in the middle of the forest. So you could see this apt combination of the 9-story or 5-story or 3-story buildings that were all intertwined with all of the ponds and playgrounds and green areas. It was fascinating. So this was the neighborhood for 3,000 or 5,000 people, I think, and then you take another bus, and then you take 2 or 3 more kilometers in the pine tree forest, and there's another residential area, and there's another residential area. It was really fascinating and impressive.
Thank you very much for this testimony, because indeed this neighborhood in Lithuania was highly appraised already back in the time, so Lenin Prize kind of as a stamp on big success. And there were others more picturesque, if you wish, or idyllic neighborhoods created across the Soviet Union. Minsk was very famous for its residential neighborhoods that were also very green, had system of pedestrian walks, like Sykhiv partially was supposed to have. What another example? Tallinn also. I mean, Baltic republics in that sense were quite particular and indeed quite successful in respecting the guidelines or taking them seriously. Well, and I don't know, may I ask you a question? What's your, in comparison maybe to Lithuania, how do you experience Sykhiv? So what's, did you feel it was similar, different?
How do I see Sykhiv? How do I perceive Sykhiv? Well, Lviv-born person in several generations, and I know what has been here before. It was the largest lake here than anywhere in other places in Lviv, and now there is this marketplace. And then you have nowhere else to go and swim and have some fun. And they only have these asphalted areas. So his neighborhood and leisure areas next to Iskra. They have the benches. Okay, please relax here and breathe all of these exhaust gases. But when you need really to try hard to find the green area. And actually, as they used to say in the Soviet Union, there is a lot to be done here, but we need to get back to what has been here before. And this is just a very broad topic for discussion, and it might take a lot of time how we could resume the previous designs. But actually there is a lot of hope, because many young people go all over the world and they see many places elsewhere. Even in Poland, which is very close, people see different types of green areas, leisure areas. So this is not the sleeping neighborhood, but
розвиватися, і оце є головне, щоб людина розвивалася. А то минулого року у нас тут були дні європейської спадщини, і слухав і почув в кінці внесок зробив я з того такий, що нам парк потрібний, а в парку, щоб була алейка, а на алейці, щоб стояла лавочка, а біля лавочки добре, якщо буде стояти ліхтарик. Більше нічого не треба. Дома посиділи, тепер вийдемо, знов посидимо. Розумієте, я взагалі в шоці. А світ, на щастя, розвивається. Дякую.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much. But so the message to transmit to the future generation of architects is to find that lake. Where is that lake? Where was that lake? Or maybe there another lake that could be developed. That's great. Thanks.
Thank you for interesting lecture. My question relates a bit to different section from the architecture, but I hope it's somehow probably you will give more context to this. Since 1957 in Moscow there was a started debate in the journal Вопросы литературы about the Romanticism. It was a kind of new wave of romantic feeling in the Soviet Union. A lot of writers, they turned to romantic attitude to nature, to heritage. They started writing different works about the neglected heritage. Then they got problems with the state, but then do you see actually this as a part of this turn, the second Romanticism which appeared after Stalinism in the Soviet Union? Because what I hear that you situate this debate as between modernists and kind of new generation of modernists, but then were they exposed to general trends in general?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great question. Indeed, I didn't get to talk about larger context because I was somewhat limited in time. But indeed, there is now a term coined already, socialist romanticism. So there was socialist realism, and 1950s, 1960s might be understood as some kind of socialist romanticism, and architects clearly were part and parcel of that change of the mood, turn to certain, I sometimes call it not romanticism but lyricism, so there is really much more appreciation for both old architecture, so inherited bits and pieces of old cities that were still preserved, but also shifting, well, what I said about the shifting in scale, caring about the human perspective much more. I do link it indeed to greater awareness about the human needs, a certain turn towards human being that I think is also linked to the larger post-war sentiment of cherishing life in general, and it had also interesting replications in different national or regional contexts, because this is also the time of turning to vernacular architecture or folkloric traditions, and this we also find all across the Soviet Union and at large in Eastern Europe. And again, this heritage is not, it's not about idealization of the past, it's rather using or recycling these different traditions, forms, patterns, themes, in order to instill new meaning into socialism, basically. So it's fighting for finding the formula for socialism with human face. So yeah, of course, architects were not immune to the changing moods in society, and this kind of architecture was a response to the need to revisit these grand schemes of the previous epoch.
Дякуємо ще раз, Дарія Бочарникова.